7, the clock has started. Yes, sir, reading it loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, there, Bravo.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and welcome to the September 19 edition of Space News. This is Peter Aylward, and I have Michael Abdullah and Angelo De Grazia with me again from the Space Association of Australia. Hey, gents.
G'day, Peter.
Hello.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to start some Australian news for you. We're getting more and more Australian news now that the agency's here. Rocket launches have been touted for Queensland as the state government launches the Space Industry Inquiry. An inquiry is being launched into how Queensland could become the home of research, design and manufacturing for the nation's future space needs. Queensland Development Minister Cameron Dick said he could see Queensland play a leading role in developing technologies like rockets and satellites, from design through to manufacturing and even launch zones. Mr Dick said he had met with leaders from the newly formed Australian Space Agency to spruik the state's potential, and that hundreds of jobs could be created in Queensland with the expansion of space technology. The Australian space industry is worth between $3 and $4 billion annually and employs around 10,000 people. It is not the first time a government has floated the idea of a space hub, with former Queensland Premier Sir Joe Bjelke-Petersen backing a proposal for a rocket launch facility in 1986 known as the Cape York Spaceport. The CEO of Queensland-based Gilmore Space Technologies, Adam Gilmore, said there was a huge potential for a space facility in Queensland. We're in the middle of developing a hybrid rocket that will send small satellites into orbit, Mr Gilmore said. We're also pretty close to securing another large round of investment funding that's going to allow us to develop a full orbital vehicle and send satellites into space. But we don't have anywhere to launch them from here in Australia. We've done a lot of trajectory analysis and figured out the best place to launch satellites from Australia is the coast of Queensland. Angelo.
Okay, let's go to the International Space Station. A Russian cosmonaut posted a video from the ISS to demonstrate all is well after a recent air leak. Sergei Prokopyev used the video to show that conditions were normal on the station and that the hole in the Soyuz spacecraft had been patched. The video was in response to rumours in Russia that the situation on the station was worse than what was being reported. As you can see, we stay here freely without our spacesuits. No one is plugging the hole with their finger, as the media has claimed, Prokopyev said. The cause of the hole remains under investigation. Meanwhile, a NASA astronaut said the leak in a Soyuz spacecraft was not caused by the station's crew. Drew Fustel, the current ISS commander, said that it was actually a shame and somewhat embarrassing that some people were attempting to blame the crew, and more specifically the American crew, for the small hole found in the Soyuz orbital module. The focus of ongoing investigations into the leak has been on damage during the spacecraft's construction and launch processing. My hope is that the investigation really do discover what occurred that caused this clearly man-made hole in the side of the spacecraft, Fustel said. It appears that a spacewalk is being planned to investigate the origins of the leak. Very intriguing. Moving on to NASA General. NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine will meet his Russian counterpart in person next month. In a rare joint statement, NASA and Roscosmos confirmed earlier Russian statements that the two would meet at Baikonur during the launch of a Soyuz spacecraft to the International Space Station on or around October the 10th. The statement also addressed the Russian investigation into a hole in a Soyuz spacecraft docked to the station found a few weeks ago, and said that the agencies would refrain from making any preliminary conclusions and providing any explanations until Roscosmos-led investigation is complete. That statement comes amid rumours, primarily in Russian media, about who might have caused the hole in the spacecraft. Also, the last Delta II rocket launches NASA's satellite to map Earth's ice with space laser. The ULA, or United Launch Alliance, built rocket was launched from Launch Complex 2 at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, carrying the ICE-SAT-2 satellite. The Delta II has over the course of 30 years, from 1989, lofted the first GPS satellites, deployed commercial telecommunications constellations, and sent NASA robotic probes to explore and study the Moon, Mars, and the asteroids. It was the 155th launch of this rocket and is one of the most reliable rockets in the world. After the launch, ULA announced that the last built but not flown Delta II rocket will join a lineup of historic rockets in the Rocket Garden on display at NASA's Kennedy Space Center Visitors Complex, Cape Canaveral, Florida. SLS Orion. The mobile launch platform for NASA's Space Launch System is in the Vehicle Assembly Building after tests on its launch pad. The platform, built outside the Vertical Assembly Building, entered the massive building at the Kennedy Space Center for the first time last week after completing a set of fit tests at Launch Complex 39B. The platform, originally built for the Constellation program and modified for the SLS, will undergo additional verification and validation work inside the Vertical Assembly Building for the next several months. Meanwhile, NASA's Orion spacecraft passed a final test of its parachute system. During the test last week at the Yuma Proving Ground in Arizona, an Orion capsule model was released from a C-17 cargo aircraft at an altitude of nearly 10,000 metres, deploying its 3 parachutes to descend to a landing on the desert floor. Early review of the tests indicate the parachutes performed as planned. This test was the last planned before the parachutes are approved for use on future crewed Orion missions. Michael.
Okay, let's look at NASA, Lunar and Planetary. NASA's Dawn mission to the asteroid belt is nearing its end. Project officials said recently that they expect the spacecraft, currently orbiting the dwarf planet Ceres, will run out of hydrazine propellant by the middle of October. That will deprive the spacecraft of its ability to control its attitude, cutting off communication with the Earth. The spacecraft, launched in 2007, studied Ceres as well as the large asteroid Vesta. Once Dawn runs out of hydrazine, it should remain in a stable orbit around Ceres for at least 20 years. NASA has started the 45-day clock in its efforts to revive the Opportunity Mars rover. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory said last week that dust levels in the atmosphere above the rover have dropped below a threshold announced by NASA last month, allowing enough sunlight to reach the rover for it to potentially start generating power again. Controllers will perform an active listening campaign, broadcasting commands to the rover in the hope that the spacecraft, silent for more than 3 months, will respond. As reported in last week's Space News, some former project engineers have criticised plans to perform this campaign for only 45 days. Although NASA says it will continue to listen for signals passively without broadcasting commands for months afterwards. Peter.
All right, let's move over to China. The latest Chinese launch used a parafoil to guide the descent of a payload fairing section. The parafoil deployed from a payload fairing half after the fairing was jettisoned from a Long March 2C rocket during a recent launch. The parafoil is intended to provide some manoeuvrability to the fairing to keep it from crashing into inhabited areas, but could be used to eventually recover and reuse it. SpaceX in the US has been testing a similar approach in its efforts to recover Falcon 9 payload fairings. In other Chinese space news, China plans to launch 7 more Beidou navigation satellites this year. China has launched 11 Beidou satellites so far this year, with 6 more scheduled for launch to medium Earth orbit and the 7th to geostationary orbit by the end of the year. The overall 35 satellite Beidou system, providing global coverage from medium Earth orbit and geosynchronous Earth orbit, is scheduled to enter service in the first half of 2020. And Mike, Japan.
Okay, controllers scrapped a landing rehearsal for Japan's Hayabusa 2 asteroid spacecraft because of technical problems. Controllers stopped the spacecraft from approaching the asteroid Ryugu when its lasers no longer provided accurate distance data as the spacecraft approached to within 600 metres of the surface. Engineers speculate that the pitch-black surface of the asteroid hindered the laser and are considering alternative procedures to collect altitude data. Angelo.
Okay, let's talk commercial space. Major launch companies seeing a potentially permanent downturn in the GEO satellite market are looking to other markets to make up for the lost business. During a panel session at the World Satellite Business Week conference last week, executives of several launch companies acknowledged a soft market for GEO satellites, with some predicting that the lower levels of GEO satellite orders may never rebound to earlier levels. Those companies are seeking increased government business to make up for some of that decline, as well as new markets like commercial human spaceflight. Meanwhile, at the small end of the launch market, companies expect a shakeout in the next few years. Those currently operating and developing small launches say that the dozens of startups currently working on such vehicles, at the last count I think there was 80 serious contenders, can't be sustained, and the technical and financial problems will cause most of them to fail. One company expected only 5 to 6 small launch startups to survive that shakeout to compete for what they still believe is significant demand for small sat companies. Another one of these 80 companies, Up Aerospace, launched a sounding rocket last week from Spaceport America, carrying a NASA experiment. The company's Space Loft rocket lifted off from the New Mexico spaceport and reached a planned peak altitude of about 115 kilometres. The rocket carried the Adaptable Deployable Entry and Placement Technology, ADEPT, a NASA experiment to test deployable re-entry heat shields. Very exciting. Let's turn to SpaceX. SpaceX successfully launched a communications satellite for Telesat last week. The Falcon 9 lifted off from the Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral, and a launch which was delayed by more than an hour because of weather. The Falcon 9 deployed the Telstar 18 Vantage satellite into geostationary transfer orbit 32 minutes after liftoff. The satellite, built by SSL, will provide C and KU band services for the Asia-Pacific region. Not long after the launch, the booster landed successfully on the drone ship Of Course I Still Love You, stationed in the Atlantic Ocean. The launch was the 16th this year for SpaceX, and it is the 5th Block 5 and the first in more than a month. So SpaceX onwards and upwards. More SpaceX news. SpaceX announced in a media teaser last week plans to send someone around the moon on its BFR, or the Big Falcon rocket, vehicle. In a pair of tweets late last week, the company said that it will announce the identity of the world's first privileged passenger to fly around the moon at an event on Monday evening.
It has been 50 years since Apollo 8 achieved lunar orbit in 1968. The time has come for civilians to fly to the moon. In 2023, SpaceX will launch the world's first private lunar mission with its spacecraft, BFR. The first passenger will be Japanese entrepreneur Yusaku Maezawa, a globally renowned art collector who believes art has the power to promote world peace. Maezawa made a bold decision. A painter, photographer, musician, film director, fashion designer, Maezawa will invite artists that represent Earth on his journey to the moon. The distance to the moon is 240,000 miles. the crew will spend a week in space. What will they feel when they see the moon? When they see Earth in full view? And what will they create? Their works will certainly become a legacy for humankind. An awe-inspiring, global, universal art project is about to begin. Dear Moon.
Alright, well finally this week, NASA's coverage of the conclusion of the Cassini mission last year won an Emmy. JPL won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Original Interactive Program during the Creative Arts Emmy Awards announced just recently. The award recognised the work by JPL for its coverage of the grand finale phase of the mission, concluding when Cassini plunged into Saturn's atmosphere last September. The award recognises a multifaceted interactive campaign involving discussion to the conclusion of the mission and Cassini's achievements using live video and social media. Yes, well there you go. Well, that's it for this week's news. Thank you, gentlemen, and it's back to you, Andrew.